The agenda this week examined toxic cultures in professional sports, got political with Giller Prize winning novelist Ian Williams, and reviewed China's past decade of expansion with journalist Joanna Chiu. The agenda's week in review begins getting perspective on what's being called the Great Resignation.
One of the things that could be driving what we're dabbling at calling a great resignation is just that people have had a period of time to be very self reflective and think about what's next. And maybe some people are investing in themselves in the very same way that we expect people to invest themselves in terms of new training, reskilling for this thing called the future of work, right? So, to the extent that the great resignation is people making different career moves or changes, I actually think that could be a fantastic thing for Canada, but it's not quite bearing out in the data just yet.
Right, and we'll pick up on that in just a few minutes. Dina, how about to you? To the extent that it's happening in Canada, what do you think is driving it?
I mean, I don't really see it as the Great Resignation. I think it's kind of like a protest. And I think a lot of workers are saying, we actually don't want to go back to work that is stressful, that is precarious, that is unsafe, where we constantly have to be thinking about how to protect ourselves and how to protect our families when we go home. For sure, there are those folks who have been able to retrain and take this moment. But I think for a lot of workers, they're also saying, you know what, if you want me to come back to work, you got to change those working conditions. And I'm not prepared for this kind of, bad job anymore.
Robin, what has your reporting uncovered in this area?
I say this as a reporter and also as a mother of a 2- and 4-year-old. I think it's survival. I think especially anyone who's had little children through the last year and a half, you are pushed to the brink every day with no end in sight, and that forces you to make some changes.
Make some changes and sort of fill in that blank a little bit more. What have you done?
What have I done? Well, I spend most weekends working. That's one example. So it's been a real interesting year as we've been at the Globe unrolling our Power Gap series, which is something we started before the pandemic, and it's been looking at gender inequities in the workplace. And I have to say, I hope my editors aren't listening, but the series is, I have some stories that we're supposed to run by now, but just can't. Last week, I had to take 3 days off work because my 2-year-old had a cough and we had to go get COVID tests, and I had to get a COVID test. And my 4-year-old can't go to school when my 2-year-old is off waiting for a COVID test, which means I end up working on the weekends. And I worked 2 nights once my husband got home from work to make up the time. And this is just, not an unusual week for me. This has been a constant barrage for the last year and a half. And I know it's been constant for so many parents out there, and especially this like double whammy of, especially earlier on, where you couldn't rely on grandparents, you couldn't rely on those people that usually help you carry water through these types of regular childhood illnesses. It's been so hard, and I'm really lucky that I work at a workplace that's very flexible and lets me take these extra types of shifts to make up the time, but so many people do not have that kind of flexibility, and I have no idea how they're doing it.
But Dina, let me put this to you, and you tell me if there's anything to it. We've for many, many years had employees here in the province of Ontario who feel underappreciated, who feel they're not being paid enough, who feel their workplaces aren't safe enough, who, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and yet they've still gone to work anyway, for the most part. We are starting to see data that suggests, certainly in the States, to a lesser extent here, people aren't putting up with that as much anymore. What's the straw that's breaking the camel's back this time?
I mean, I think that there's 2 or 3 different scenarios, because of course we're dealing with a mass amount of workers. I mean, there are those workers who didn't have a choice during the pandemic to stay at home, and they've just had to go to work and put up with the kinds of working conditions that we know are to be true and that have been exposed during the pandemic. So, short-term, part-time, temp agency work. Then there are those workers who we're working in the sort of low wage sector, in entertainment, hospitality, tourism, the restaurant industry. And I think finally got a bit of a chance out of the grind of that daily type of work. Because when you're working 12 to 14 hours a day and you're in that daily grind, it's hard to imagine doing anything else. And I think for some folks who are in those minimum wage jobs, say in the restaurant sector, they have taken this opportunity to move into another area of work, which I think has been great. And then there are people, like Robin, who have little kids or who have kids who have not been able to be vaccinated yet, and who basically are feeling like they're going to put their lives and their children's lives at risk during a pandemic, and so have chosen to not go back to work and have made that really brutal decision, because it's meant that for many people, they're now working 2 or 3 jobs, or they're doing split shifts, or they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And so we are seeing huge rising debt, poverty, and a massive increase in stress of people trying to figure out how to deal with this new labor market. But I think the biggest issue here is also how to also stay healthy and well and keep their families safe during this time period.
There seems to be something about the NBA and about basketball where they do these things sort of better than everybody else. They don't seem to have, they have different kinds of scandals, but not this kind of scandal. Any ideas about that?
I mean, the idea that comes to mind is that the NBA, and maybe to a smaller extent the other 3 major leagues in North America, are being dragged along by their labor. They're being dragged along by people who have an eye to the public, an eye to public conscience, that can't really hide their identities when they're on the ice or when they're on the court. The NBA has kind of set aside an example where the players have dictated terms, in a sense, been able to kind of push the issue, and has moved the league to kind of be a partner, not just a partner with the players, but just in their communities. When Jacob Blake, he was a black man who was shot by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 2020. We say the WNBA, but the movement I'm about to describe is more descriptive of the WNBA and other women's sports. Players started to walk off the job in protest. It was widespread, it was effective, and it had impacts in different ways of life. A lot of academics here in Canada actually spoke about how the impact of that walk-off changed how leagues how as partners can be more involved and more engaged with not just players, but the fan bases. And we saw that the NBA, for example, opened their arenas. A lot of member franchises became election centers and became facilities for vaccinations and other uses. So, owners and governors within the NBA, they had to listen because they had no choice. Because without their players, what is it?
Now, that's a great point. Bruce, let me get you to comment on that, because the fact is the NBA has almost all the time, not in the case of China, but almost all the time encouraged their players to speak freely, to put slogans on their shirts. They were the first league to close down during COVID. Seems to me NHL players, conversely, tend to be very apolitical and really don't want to get into controversies at all when they speak. Maybe you could contrast and compare, Bruce, the 2 cultures there and tell us why that is.
Well, there's fundamental difference when it comes to empowerment within the sport, right? In hockey, it's more about the team than it is about the individual, even with star players. The idea in Canadian Olympic hockey that if Sidney Crosby can back check, so can you. The fact that the sport allows great players to be dragged down by the lesser players in the sport. There's a misguided egalitarianism, I would say, is probably the way to describe that. Whereas in basketball, there's so much more empowerment of players. But then you get into, so the idea that the leagues are more progressive, the NBA is clearly ahead of any other league on this. The NBA is the most forward-thinking league, the most socially progressive league. But Perry's exactly right. A huge part of that is because of their labor. It dovetails with their business interests to do so, because in the NBA, if you lose your players, then you have significant problems. Now, the other side of this is the NHL. The NHL has leaden instincts when it comes to things not only in hockey but outside of hockey. When the George Floyd protests erupted after he was shot in Minnesota, the NHL waited. It kept playing, right? Like while other leagues shut down. When COVID happened, they were the last league to stop playing, right? Like the NBA, within a half hour of Rudy Gobert testing positive, shut the league down. The NHL waited until the next day. You can come back to the Kyle Beach situation here. The instincts of the NHL were really, really poor in that they fined the team $2 million, which is a relatively minor fine in the context of previous fines for misbehavior in the NHL. The players drive the agenda in the NBA to a significant degree, and it's a business-related kind of, again, dovetailing of interests. And maybe that's why there have been fewer examples of players being taken advantage of in significantly deleterious ways, because the players have more agency in basketball than they do in almost any other sport.
The title of the book is Disorientation. What did you mean by that?
So disorientation for me is the response that racialized people have to random or unprovoked reminders of our race. So we're going about our business, just doing our thing, and then someone interrupts our life to tell us about someone they know who likes reggae, or to ask where you're from, or some other kind of indication that says you are other, right? In this moment, you are a black subject, and you are no longer the guy just trying to buy a shirt at H&M. Yeah, so that's disorientation. And I guess the second part to that, Nam, is that the recovery of that, from that disorientation, also burns up so much mental energy for people of color.
I think some people might hear that and say, so what? It's just maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe the person is complimenting you because you remind them of Michael Jordan, whatever it is. But what does it do to the person who's getting that message?
Right. Yeah, I don't know about people's intentions. I don't read hearts or anything like that for a living. But I know its effect on me to snap me out of the task that I'm doing and then to refocus. People say this about the internet too, right? Like, you're doing one thing, you get sidetracked, and it takes, 15 minutes to get back on track? Now imagine that in like human terms. You're trying to focus on something or trying to do your job, you get snapped out of it, and how much mental energy do you burn up on your commute back? Or, when you could be having really sort of engaged moments with your family, processing the day's events through a racial lens.
Why write a book of essays in this particular time on this subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, last year when I began, I was living in Vancouver at the time. There were wildfires. There was a pandemic really starting to take hold here in North America. And of course, the justice movements that started in the US and spread around the world. And I put aside the novel that I was working on in order to write this book. It had a kind of urgency to it. I turned 40 a few years ago. And to be honest with you, I was kind of confused internally. There was a lot of noise that was happening externally.
Confused about what?
Confused about how this world can still exist, although we all know better, right? I mean, the social system can still exist and the justice system can still propagate injustices, although we all know better. And all of the noise that I was hearing around me was kind of similar to the noise inside of me. So I decided, Ian, there's no safety on shore, right? There's no safety trying to avoid this kind of conversation. You need to figure out what you think, and you need to understand how this world is working, because it's affecting you and breaking you down on a daily basis. And so that's the urgency and the impetus behind this book, Nam.
You said that you were avoiding it, and you write, I know a fair bit, but never enough to seize authority. My dissatisfaction with my knowledge, coupled with my tepid emotions, occasionally nauseates me. Would I not be a better human if I were informed and angry? Then I could be righteous. I should be vocal, more than vocal, loud. I have received the message that to be Black these days is to be perpetually outraged and distressed, fed up, tired. To be anything apart from that is treacherous and out of touch. Is that what you mean?
Wow. Yeah. So I admire activists. I admire people who are very vocal, and I admire those people who are on the front lines, doing work in our courts and our civil systems. But not all of us have the fortitude or temperament to do that kind of racial work. And so the fact that a Black person in a moment of injustice is quiet doesn't mean that that Black person does not care or is not necessarily engaged. There are features of personality too that determine how we respond to tragedy. Some of us get sad, some of us just drink ourselves into forgetfulness, right? And what I wanted to do in that quotation is recognize what's expected of us and then give people of color options or ways to be themselves still, right? That we don't have to sacrifice ourselves to some kind of single universal idea of what Blackness is or does. We can care and we can further progress in our own ways.
Well, here's the voice of China answering back. This is from a state-run organ called Global Times. And here's the comment. Canada, the UK, and Australia, 3 members of the Five Eyes Alliance, have recently taken action to put pressure on China. They have formed a US-centered, racist, and mafia-styled community, willfully and arrogantly provoking China and trying to consolidate their hegemony as all gangsters do. They are becoming a racist axis aimed at stifling the development rights of 1.4 billion Chinese. The formation of 4 states, except the UK, is the result of British colonization. Those countries share the Anglo-Saxon civilization. With a common language, a common historical background, and a coordinated attack target, such an axis is destined to erode international relations and allow hooliganism to rise to the diplomatic stage. Global diplomacy in the 21st century must not be hijacked by a fake international community with an axis of white supremacy. I hear you laughing, but that's axis of white supremacy. What do you make of that kind of language?
What's interesting in that statement is it reflects some of the main talking points that the CCP uses to try to discredit international criticism. Canada, and along with other states, have been trying to work more on a multilateral level to put pressure on Beijing against what is happening, like the internment of around 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps in Xinjiang. Countries feel that speaking as a group, they have a stronger voice than alone, which I think makes a lot of sense. But Beijing is trying to shape this and make it seem like a racist attack, that any criticism of China is racist. And they're really, really deliberately trying to encourage conflation of the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion Chinese people, citizens, and the Chinese state. What is concerning to me is that while this seems ridiculous when you see it, flash across the screen, many people in the West do conflate Chinese people and the Chinese state. Former President Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he thinks all international students from China are spies, that they should be treated as spies. And scientists in the US have been persecuted and, found that there was no basis to these persecutions. And a lot of experts on China worry that this Red Scare, this conflation of the CCP and the Chinese people, is playing into what Beijing most wants to see. It wants to paralyze more productive and nuanced dialogue in the West by making it seem as if this is a racist attack that is just going to stoke xenophobia. Unfortunately, in the West, we haven't been very nuanced in showing that that's not what they're saying. We're not conflating the people of the states. And in my reporting, I draw on decades of warnings and testimonials from people of Chinese descent in countries like Canada, where they've been trying to warn that Beijing has been trying to do this, trying to support these narratives. But time and again, they have been ignored. They've been ignored now. They continue to feel very just not supported. Myself, when I have reported on human rights in Xinjiang and received hundreds of threatening messages, going to the police, they tell me there's nothing they could do. Talking to the Bill Blair's office in Ministry of Public Safety. Meanwhile, they say Canadians who feel concerned about threats from foreign sources should go to the police. But when people go to the police say there's nothing they can do. So it's kind of a circular response people get from authorities that make them feel really unsupported, and that it's playing into this myth that people of Chinese descent are this homogenous group that all support what Beijing is doing, which isn't true.
You just used the word nuance there in that answer, and I think, if memory serves, about 3/4 of the way through the book, you talk about the fact that we're not living in times where we do nuance very well, and these are times in which maybe being able to act on a global stage with a little more nuance would be very helpful. What do we do about that?
So the cabinet in the U.S. Canada just had a reshuffling of the cabinet. But in general, people tell me that they worry there's not enough expertise on China advising governments. The Liberal Party in Canada, and definitely, many ruling parties in Canada, most of their advisors in China have been people in the business world, where, of course, they have really valuable lived experiences doing business in China, but they also have vested interests, and they also have interests in making sure that relations are as friendly as possible so it doesn't affect the business relationship.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.